What's up, guys? Hello, the Football Talk here. We have arrived at the true off-season, and now we can take some time to really dive into all 32 teams. Over the next 4 weeks, we'll go through each division, alternating between NFC and AFC, break down every team's draft class, how those players fit into the roster, and how it may coincide with some of the other moves they've made. And then at the end of every video, I'll rank the 4 drafts against each other, not just looking at the young talent that they acquired, but also considering the process behind the madness and what they were able to accomplish overall, largely based on my personal evaluations. I'll mention any moves that we saw beforehand in order to give some context, but for the purpose of this exercise, I'll only talk about trades, take those into account that actually happened during the draft. Of course, if you want more detailed breakdowns of my top 10 plus prospects at every position, my general overview of the draft, list of impact undrafted free agents, and so much more, just make sure to head over to my page, Footballtalk.com. Just a quick heads up, if you can't tell, I'm dealing with COVID right now, so please bear with me here as I'm trying to get back to 100%, but I love doing this series every year and hope you can appreciate the effort I put into these. Timestamps for each individual team and the divisional draft rankings are down below, but without wasting any more time, let's get into our first division here, which is the NFC North, and the first team here is the Chicago Bears, who started the draft with 6 picks and ended up making 11 selections, trading back 4 times. Even though they didn't own a first rounder due to moving up for quarterback Justin Fields a year ago. Let me just quickly run for the picks here. Second round, 39th overall, Kyle Gordon, the cornerback out of Washington. Also second round, 48th overall, Jaquan Brisker, the safety out of Penn State. Third round, 71st overall, Velus Jones Jr., the wide receiver out of Tennessee. 2 fifth-round picks, Braxton Jones, the offensive tackle out of Southern Utah State. And Dominic Robinson, the edge defender out of Miami of Ohio. Then we have 3 sixth-round picks, Zach Thomas, the interior offensive lineman / offensive tackle out of San Diego State, Treston Ebner, the running back out of Baylor, Doug Kramer, the interior offensive lineman out of Illinois, and then 3 more picks in the 7th round, Ja'Tyre Carter, the interior offensive lineman out of Southern University, Elijah Hicks, the safety out of Cal, and then Trenton Gill, the punter out of NC State. So first up here with Kyle Gordon, solid 200 pounds, loose hips, has one of the best change of directions in this entire draft among corners, ran the 20-yard shuttle in less than 4 seconds, has that inside-out experience in man and zone for Washington, a very diverse scheme I would call it, shows sufficient instinct and that ability to get back into phase after false steps. There's some pretty impressive moments where he's leaned the wrong way and the defender seemingly has him beat, but he somehow swivels back around and gets back into the hip pocket of the receiver. He did only spend 69 snaps in man coverage last season, and ran a 4.52 at the combine. So speed is maybe a bit of a question mark. I didn't quite see it show up on tape, and I think actually if you look at him and Trent McDuffie, the other corner of Washington, McDuffie at this point certainly the better player in terms of overall tackling, instinct in zone and stuff like that, but Gordon probably the more talented to some degree here in terms of a pure outside cornerback, and I think he'll start right away across from Jalen Johnson, so that pick made a lot of sense to me. And so did Brisker, the second pick, and a safety out of Penn State. This is actually the pick they acquired from the Khalil Mack trade. Look at the numbers for Brisker in coverage last season, limiting quarterbacks to just 12 completions for just over 100 yards and 1 touchdown on 21 targets this past year, while intercepting 2 of those himself. Tested above the 80th percentile across the board, and that's even without really looking to the tape where he's a flying missile out there, racing up the alley in the run game and blowing things up, as well as in the pass game, just the instinct. There's some plays on tape where he's basically becoming a free defender. His man, the tight end, staying in protection against Wisconsin. That one comes to mind where he's just floating to the open target and someone feels it coming and picks off the pass to end that game. Very impressive, instinctual player and one of my personal favorites in this draft. The issue here went from 1 to 10 missed tackles last year. Now that has something to do with the shoulder harness that he suffered and that he was kind of dealing with throughout the year, so that people there have said not to really bang him too much for that, but also for the modern NFL with a lot of the too high safety structures, and him probably having to rotate into the deep post to some degree for some schemes. Spent about half of his snaps in the box last season according to Pro Football Focus, so maybe for the modern wide open NFL, as a deep safety at least, if you leave him in a post, I'm not 100% sure if that's his best role, but I think he'll complement Eddie Jackson extremely well, when he can rotate that guy deep and then bring Brisker down as a robber or into the flats. And I think with the shoulder being back to 100%, those tackling issues are pretty much gone, because I think he's actually a very good tackler in terms of breaking down in space and shooting his hips through and finishing guys to the ground. So I really think that was a great pick. Those two guys in the secondary, they definitely needed that. And then Velus Jones Jr. is the one a bit surprising here. Certainly didn't expect him to go on day 2. But you look at the numbers, 8.3 yards after the catch last season and 15 yards per punt return, while also running a blazing 4.31 on the 40 at the combine. So in terms of a guy who can create with the ball in his hands and has that speed to run away from the defense, he's certainly very intriguing. On the negative side, some unnecessary steps at the top of the routes where he can give away where he's going and allow defenders to drive on the ball. Also just 3 contested catch last season, so he's not going to bring you a whole lot in that area. And he'll be a 25-year-old rookie. That's kind of why I was confused as to him going this early. And you have to question, is he the number 3 now on offense? Is he maybe more of a gadget player early on? Will he take on some of the return duties with Tariq Cohen still unsigned? Either way, he's certainly a playmaker, but in this area, definitely a bit early for my taste. And then we get to Braxton Jones, who is an impressive specimen in terms of 35.5-inch arms. Consistently puts his body in between the defender and the ball as a run blocker, so he has that for him. Very good feet. Did allow 3 sacks last season, but only 12 extra pressures on over 700 pass blocking snaps since 2020. He's not somebody who's going to create a lot of displacement in the run game and kind of lacks that urgency working up to the second level, while also having a really bad habit of dipping his head as he initiates contact with rushers and that kind of weak post leg in terms of guys countering back to the inside and him being able to shut that down. You look at that roster there, Tevin Jenkins and Larry Borum, probably signing at those 2 tackle spots, but the next guy would be Julian Davenport, so you could see this guy early on the field than you'd expect, and kind of earlier than he's ready for maybe. Next up is Robinson, who's kind of an interesting prospect here, transitioned from wide receiver to defensive end in 2020, had 28 total pressures on just under 250 pass rushing snaps this last year, 81-inch wingspan and a 41-inch vert, so he's kind of a crazy athlete for the position, but he also seemed constantly just run into blockers and not really accomplish anything on his rushes. And at this point, a complete unknown in the run game, oftentimes actually taken off in early downs, and the few times we did see him there, he got driven backwards usually. Along with Robert Quinn coming off his best season since his day with the Rams, now I'm having 2 toolsy guys on the edge with Robinson and Travis Gibson was a 5th rounder for them a couple of years ago. I think that makes some sense with Quinn especially, kind of the same skill set in terms of a long guy who has that speed off the edge. I think Robinson brings a lot of those intriguing qualities to the table, and he does flash on tape, but still has a long way to go, and I think they can bring him along there. And then Zach Thomas, quality started at both tackle spots in the last 2 years, with Pro Football Focus grades above 87 in both. Did allow 5 sacks for the past 3 years combined, but only 27 additional pressures across nearly 1,000 pass blocking snaps, so a very consistent player overall. However, does have a narrow base in the run game, and you see him on the ground too much. Largely kind of catches pass rushers and makes himself susceptible to speed to power, and he'll be a 24-year-old rookie. So certainly some things that he brings to the table in terms of consistency that he saw at San Diego State, but also a couple of things that he has to work on in terms of his technique. Could be competing for either guard spot really, depending on if they move Cody Whitehair back to center, and should just add some competition to the room that desperately needs some more help. And this will be a kind of a theme for them when you look at the rest of day 3. Then split in between is Tristan Ebner, the running back / offensive weapon for Baylor, ran a 4.43 at the combine, and will definitely be a key special teamer, return specialist, and gadget player. I thought that whatever offense was going to bring him in. Does like the physicality, I believe, to be a full-time running back, and not the most refined route runner, so he's going to have to work on that. But as a passing down return specialist, behind David Montgomery and Khalil Herbert, I kind of like what he brings to the table if that's really the only way that you utilize him. Then you get to Doug Kramer, who is a very fun player in terms of more than 3,000 career snaps at center, all of them. Has that great snap-to-step quickness and the agility to reach 1-techs or 2 eyes for wide zone plays consistently. Keeps his head on the swivel in pass pro, and you look at the testing numbers at the Illinois Pro Day, 4.95 in the 40 and 26 rep on the bench press, along with being just a very crafty player. Certainly on the short end at 6'2 and I think only 32-inch arms, and that does create some problems against long defensive linemen he's going to face in the NFL. But once again, depending on the configuration of the offensive line, at worst he's going to be a rock-solid backup at the center spot, and I could see him starting if that makes the best sense in terms of keeping Whitehair at that guard spot, him sliding in at center, and then a competition for the other guard spot. That's going to be interesting to watch, but I think, like I said, at worst, he's going to be a highly competent backup. And then Ja'Tai Carter, kind of the opposite, more of a raw player. Definitely some pop in his hands in the run game. And those large mids, they can turn to claws as a pass protector. He never allowed a sack across 573 career pass blocking snaps, and only 2 pro pressures last season on over 300. I don't believe he really latches those hands and controls blocks enough than his physical profile would indicate in the run game. And with those hands kind of being all over the place and leading to him bear hugging guys in protection as well. But he could be in the mix for all of those 5 spots other than center. Still has definitely a long way to go, and we might not see him on the field as a rookie, and then what the Bears did is actually give up a 6th rounder next year to acquire these back-to-back picks in the final 10 selections of the draft. With Elijah Hicks get a 5-year starter who's played all over the field. Not exactly sure what his best landing spot is. Had a breakout senior campaign, but kind of lacks any special athletic traits, I would say, and we don't have testing numbers on him, so he'll have to earn playing time on defense through special teams probably. And then for the punter, Gill, I really got nothing. He was outside the top 30 in net and gross punting average, but I think he's pretty good at placing it inside the 20. Probably could have gotten him as an undrafted free agent as well, but he'll take the place of Pat O'Donnell, who's now moved on to the division rival Packers, and I'm not going to blame them too much for it. So looking at this class overall, I like the first 2 guys they picked, and I think they will be quality starters in the secondary for years to come. I think they got some nice developmental players on the O-line, and with Robinson as this toolsy pass rusher, who hasn't played the position for very long. And I think if Kramer at any point enters the lineup, he'll be a fan favorite with a local connection and just being this crafty, gritty play up front. With that being said, if you had told me that they'd come out of this draft with 2 skill position players to help out the second-year quarterback Justin Fields, and the names were Velus Jones and Treston Ebner, who are arguably more so gadget players, I would be kind of scratching my head here, particularly considering they lost Allen Robinson and replaced him with Byron Pringle and Equanimous St. Brown. I think the haul they got is solid, but I don't quite get the idea behind it. If you say you're all in on Justin Fields as your future on the center, there's just very little proven talent around him on offense. And defensively, they've gotten 2 stars on the back end to make up for 2 impact guys in Khalil Mack and Eddie Goldman up front, but not really sure how much they've really moved forward, how much better this whole team is going to be this year. Which brings us to the next team, however, the Detroit Lions. One of 8 teams with multiple first-round picks this year, only the second and the final selection of Thursday, even though, as we can see in the second here, they didn't end up sticking with the latter one of those 2. So the 8 picks they did make, 2nd overall, Aiden Hutchinson, the edge defender out of Michigan, 12th overall, Jameson Williams, the wide receiver out of Alabama, 2nd round, 46th overall, Joshua Pascal, the edge/interior defensive lineman out of Kentucky. In the 3rd round, 97th overall, Kirby Joseph, the safety out of Illinois. 5th round, 177th overall, James Mitchell, the tight end out of Virginia Tech. 2 6th round picks, Malcolm Rodriguez, the linebacker out of Oklahoma State, and James Houston, the 4th, the edge defender out of Jackson State. And then finally in the 7th round, 237th overall, Jace Lucas, the cornerback out of Arizona State. At the top with Hutchinson, they were probably out of their minds to see Jacksonville pass on him for Trayvon Walker. Personally, it was my number 2 edge behind Kayvon Thibodeau, but I thought it was perfectly fine for them. Makes a lot of sense. Just a very smart and physical run defender, who you see on multiple occasions call out pullers, and then in the pass rush department, 60 extra pressures to go along with his 14 sacks, which were also best in the draft last year. Also led the edge group in both the agility drills at the combine, so really has that great change of direction, inside-out versatility in terms of being able to defeat tackles either way. Has a great scissors move to the outside to win with speed, and then can transition to power as he goes along with that. However, you do see a false step with the back foot that kind of limits his get-off, and he only has 32.5-inch arms. Speed to power, that conversion is there, but in terms of pure bull rush, maybe not quite has that ton of power. That's why he was my number 2 at the edge position, but it's still a top 5 prospect for me. Instantly gives that defense a worker bee up front, along with the 2 Okwara brothers and Charles Harris. Now all of a sudden that unit goes from one of the worst in terms of creating negative plays to actually one that really has lethal weapons. And speaking of lethal weapons, they kind of surprised everybody, trading up 20 spots from 32nd overall to acquire Jameson Williams, the wide receiver out of Alabama, who is coming off a torn ACL in the national championship. And it's kind of funny how they acquired him, trading up with the Vikings here, the division rivals. And after giving up picks 34 and 66, that was perfectly fine value. I definitely thought the Vikings would be asking more here. Ended up making good use of the pick that they had in the first round due to the Matt Stafford deal a year ago. You look at Jameson only having 15 catches in his first 2 years over Ohio State, but then he went nuclear last year for Alabama with nearly 1,600 receiving yards and 15 touchdowns as a first-team All-American, and that included an FBS best 11 touchdowns of 30-plus yards, so he's going to be a big play machine for them, and only 3 of 36 man targets last season were contested. A pretty advanced route runner, which is not really getting credit for because people just look at him as the speedster, but in terms of getting cleanly off the line of scrimmage, setting up his routes, and getting defenders turned the wrong way, there's a lot to like there. And then, of course, has that extra gear that kind of nobody in this draft has. When you watch some of the plays where he's just pulling away from the pursuit, does have a bit of a spindly frame, for sure, and sometimes has problems working through contact against corners that are physically gifted and are able to get in his way, while also being more so a non-factor as a blocker, I would say. But looking at this Lions receiving depth chart, they did add DJ Chark on a 1-year deal, but they needed a true speed receiver to go along with Amon-Ra St. Brown, who is more of your possession type of guy and can create big plays, but really you want him in between the numbers working those, and now you have that speed threat over the top in Jameson. He's not going to be ready week 1, but whenever he's getting out there, that receiving room all of a sudden changes. Like I said, maybe not a great blocker, but he can kind of change the math for the defense, if that makes sense, in terms of pulling out extra bodies, not allowing the defense to rotate the safety down and have that extra man in the box. So it definitely makes some sense here, even though it was surprising to a lot of people for them when they moved up, since we expect the quarterback to be the target here. Then Joshua Pascal, one of my personal favorites, real juice out of his stance and passing downs, violent hands, has a tremendous flexibility to kind of disconnect this upper and lower half. Pro Football Focus said he had a Power 5 leading 12.5% run stop rate in 2021 and 12 solo tackles for loss. So he's this disruptive player who can play up and down the line. Reminded me a lot of Deo Odeyingbo kind of out of Vanderbilt a year ago, who was a second-round pick, I believe, for the Colts. Kind of surprisingly coming off a torn Achilles. And Pascal, as far as I'm aware, he's totally healthy, and he kind of brings those same qualities to the table. He is a little slow to ID run scheme still, and has to finish rushes better, as he came up just a half-sack fraud of double digits over the last 3 years as a starter combined. And I think he's probably not going to be a full-time starter early on for the Lions, but has that tremendous explosion energy playing up front, where you can move him all across the line, and he's going to make plays for you whenever you bring him on the field. And he's going to make some of the other guys that they have on the roster expendable, seeing what he can do as a rookie. Which brings us to Kirby Joseph, who has tremendous length, range of ball skills for the safety position, is the guy who can erase angles for ball carriers routinely, working down from depth. Allowed only 9 of 19 targets his way to be completed last season for 2 touchdowns compared to his 5 interceptions. Really a breakout campaign for him. He did barely have any man coverage reps and was super grabby versus tight ends during their Senior Bowl practices. But also, you watch the tape, some of the times he's barely on the screen anymore because of how deep he drifts into space, which you can't blame him for. It's kind of what Illinois asked of him, but you would have liked to see him closer to the ball to some degree. And it's head-scratching still why he only started his final 1 of 4 years for a mostly struggling program. Detroit already has Tracy Walker, Deshaun Elliott, and Will Harris, but I think this guy can be a true impact player if he figures it out. Like I said, kind of that 1 year breakout, but I think some of the skills that he brings to the table, the length, the ball skills, the range, I think he can be a special player if he's in the right system that enhances those strengths and doesn't let him flow into space like he did at Illinois to some degree. Then we get to day 3, first up with James Mitchell here, who was my number 8 signing, I believe, and one of my sleepers in this draft. Very happy to see him come off the board here. Has the willingness and physicality to be a quality asset blocking in line, thanks to the athletic lower half and the active feet to be an excellent run blocker. And then as a receiver, good burst of the ball, pretty elusive if working around contact. If you look at the numbers, only dropping 5 of 55 catchable targets in his career. Does have a rather average athletic profile and lacks the burst to pull away on vertical routes. That's something that stood out to me because he was able to set them up well. And then at the end of those, tremendous ball tracking skills, but he's not going to be pulling away from guys. And is dealing still with the torn ACL that he suffered early in the season. But the Lions didn't have a legitimate number 2 behind Hawkinson with names like Brock Wright and Garrett Griffin. I thought Mitchell has that skill set to be a high quality number 2 and even in some spots be the primary receiving option at the time position. Certainly not going to challenge Hawkinson for the starting spot, but if Hawkinson once again deals with some injuries, you can put Mitchell out there and he can be a legitimate player for you there. And the same is true for Malcolm Rodriguez, one of my favorite linebackers in this class. In terms of instincts and eyes to decipher the plays and getting to the ball, he is right up there with the very best in this class. And this dude plays hard, man, the way he just charges into blockers. Really love to watch him play. And he surprised a lot of people with his high-level combine testing when you look at it, because he was expected to be a fairly average athlete, and he was in the 80th percentile across the board pretty much. The one major weakness that he does have is his length, just under 6 feet and only 30-inch arms. So you see him lose vision on the ball carrier and not be able to see through blocks at times, which is not going to get any better at the next level. But I could easily see him being one of the 5 names in competition with those 2 starting spots on the inside of the linebacker for the Lions, along with Alex Anzalone, Derek Barnes, Sean Dion Hamilton, and now Gerard Davis being brought back. But I don't believe any of those 4 guys have established themselves as clear-cut starters, and I think there's a path here for playing time if Rodriguez shows the smarts, the grittiness. I think the coaching staff there under Dan Campbell, they're going to love him as a player. Then we get to James Houston, who is a very different kind of profile in terms of somebody never really found his way onto the field for Florida before exploding onto the scene as a first-team FCS All-American, 24.5 tackles for loss, 16.5 sacks, and 7 forced fumbles last season. Completely blew up. And he just stands out physically versus HBCU competition, 34.5-inch arms, crazy burst upfield, and wiggles a pass rusher. He is, however, very undisciplined with his containing the run game, rarely has a plan as a pass rusher, and you see him routinely overshoot the arc, where he's not able to shorten his path. He does have all the time in the world probably to learn in Detroit, with some of the guys that I already mentioned they have here now, with Hutchinson at the top, the 2 Aquara brothers, and some more depth behind it. And he's just going to be a long down specialist early on, but the talent is certainly there, and I believe he can be a legitimate threat on 3rd downs down the road. And then finally, Chase Lucas has that speed to carry vertically, but also oily hips, and great click and close quickness to contest what look like easy completions on tape a lot of times. Very secure tackle in space, and routinely see him limit yards after the catch there that may be available. He was protected to some degree by the role as this kind of overhang zone defender for Arizona State and had limited man responsibilities, while also as a tackle he has to work on keeping his eyes up. But I thought here in the 7th makes a lot of sense. Lions get a bunch of long outside corners, and Mike Hughes probably pencil in as the starter at the nickel spot. I believe Lucas can compete for some snaps in the slot. Very smart player. At worst, if they have an injury there, he can fiddle right in, and you're not going to have a major drop-off. To get him this late here, I think that's a pretty good pick. When I envisioned what the Lions draft class would look like, only one offensive player beyond pick 12 being selected, I would have been kind of confused. However, the defense certainly needed an influx of talent, and I like a lot of the guys that they brought in. Hutchinson, of course, should be a perennial 8 to 12 sack guy. Pascal was one of my favorite draft crushes, as this guy with inside-out versatility to wreak havoc alongside him. Joseph as this rangy, big safety with ball skills. Rodriguez, a linebacker, who I could see turn into a starter this year already. Houston, a very talented, even if underdeveloped pass rusher. And then Lucas, who could be fighting for a starting gig in the slot at least 1 year from now, because I think Hughes is on a 1-year deal. Then you make the big move for Williams, who will miss some time early on, but gives you game-changing speed and can change the math for the opposing defense, like I already mentioned in terms of deploying coverage assets. And then Mitchell, also coming off a torn ACL, but having been kind of forgotten as one of the better all-around tight ends in this entire draft. Would have liked to see them take a chance on one of these quarterbacks in the middle rounds and see what that guy has for them in practice. Sure, but do I really want to blame them for not forcing a pick like that and being patient with building the house before they find their guy? No. So overall, I really like what they did here. And that has us moving on to the Green Bay Packers, who own 2 first and 2 second round picks thanks to trading Devontae Adams to Las Vegas earlier this offseason. And everybody kind of expected them to select the wide receiver in the first, but they didn't end up doing so, because 22nd overall they went with Quay Walker, the linebacker at Georgia, and 6 picks later they got the guy who played in front of him and Devontae Wyatt, the interior defensive lineman, also for the Bulldogs. Then in the second round, 34th overall, Christian Watson, the wide receiver out of North Dakota State. Third round, 92nd overall, Sean Ryan, the interior offensive lineman out of UCLA. 2 fourth rounders, 132nd overall, Romeo Dubs, the wide receiver out of Nevada. 140th overall, Zach Tom, the offensive tackle / interior offensive lineman out of Wake Forest. In the 5th round, 179th overall, Kingsley Enikbari, the edge defender out of South Carolina. And then 4 7th round picks, Tariq Carpenter, the safety out of Georgia Tech, Jonathan Ford, the interior defensive lineman out of Miami, Rasheed Walker, the offensive tackle out of Penn State, and Samari Toure, the wide receiver out of Nebraska. So Walker ended up being the first linebacker of the board here, and he was one of the big draft risers late in the process if you track betting odds. You look at him on tape, works downhill in a controlled manner versus the run, has a bounce to his step in zone coverage, and he can be a real weapon as a blitzer with his closing burst. Did have 25 pressures in 2021. So there's a lot to like here from an athletic profile and the physical player that he is. Some people had him above Nakobe Dean, the other linebacker of Georgia, and he ended up going 2 rounds early actually, even though that probably has more to do with the injury stuff with Dean, but we'll get to that when we talk about the NFC East. The negatives here for Walker does fold around a little bit too much and kind of takes himself out of run fits, but trusting false keys, and he was often subbed off for Channing Tindall on passing downs because of what that guy can bring as a spy and stuff like that. Kind of more of a loose athlete maybe. I think Walker will start right away next to Devondre Campbell, who offers a pretty similar skill set and is coming off a career year. But 22nd overall certainly easy for me. I had him valued in the 3rd round, and I know that I'm low on him than a lot of other people. But talking about off-ball linebackers in the 1st round and him being a fringe top 10 guy at the position for me, that just kind of doesn't match up. But then Devontae Wyatt I like a lot. His upside as a penetrating free technique was kind of limited by gap control and those gap exchanges that they were doing at Georgia, but has all those athletic traits, tremendous get-off and rapid hands, can win with power in that regards, but also that cross chop that he showed at Senior Bowl practices, where he was whooping ass for 2 days before he had to be taken out due to injury. Pretty impressive ability to corner his rushes and just the overall explosiveness that he brings as a player at 300 pounds. It did take him until his 4th year to really deliver any kind of significant production, and he doesn't always play up to that size at 300 pounds in the run game, as well as a pass rusher, needs to learn to transition to a secondary move more fluidly. But I think he gives that defense a disruptive element that they needed next to Kenny Clark, because they were at the very bottom of the NFL in terms of tackles for loss last season. And I think if you let him loose and kind of put him in that disruptive penetrating type of role, I think he can be a difference maker for you up front. And then early in the 2nd round, they do finally select a wide receiver, package the 2 second rounders, which were 54th and 59th overall, I believe, and facilitating the 2nd in-division trade for the Vikings here. I actually had them going with Watson at 28th overall in the ultimate mock draft, so this definitely makes a lot of sense here. Watson's a height, weight, speed beast from the FCS, running a 4.36 in the 40, jumping 38.5 inches in the vert, and a combine best 11 feet and 4 inches broad jump. He's 6'4", maybe 215 pounds or something, and he can win as a big receiver, but his movement skills, the speed that he brings to the table, they put the ball in his hands on end arounds and jet sweeps and all that kind of stuff, so he can be a real playmaker, which is indicated by 57 of his 180 touches in his career, going for 20 plus yards. Last season was his best target with 800 yards only. Never quite able to produce at a major level. Not a very complex route tree that he ran at North Dakota State, and he did have 5 drops in 2021, where there are some issues with the way that he addresses the ball down the field, the ball slipping through his hands a couple of times. But the Packers really needed to invest into his position, and I think Watson has the skill set to be a true number 1 receiver, starting at the X spot for the Packers in Matt LaFleur's offense, where at the very worst I said this, he can be a Marcus Valdes-Scantling plus, and I think his potential is a lot higher than that. So this was perfectly in line with the way I valued him, and makes a lot of sense. I said that in my ultimate mock draft, where I talked about how he's kind of the perfect receiver for both, as this guy who just gets after in the run game as a blocker, but also brings the speed and the receiving skills to make Rodgers happy. So I definitely like his fit there. And the same is true for Sean Ryan, the interior offensive lineman at UCLA. Actually started left tackle for the Bruins and played that very well. Great thickness for his frame, can create the displacement in the run game with rolling his hips through, and then has those monstrous 11-inch paws, which allow him to just grab pass rushers and not let them get away. Just 1 sack and 24 total pressures over those last 2 years combined at the left tackle spot. Has the anchor strength and just doesn't overreact as a pass protector, so I really like that about him. Just a very technically sound guy. He is a bit heavy-footed and uncomfortable getting out in space, and only has those 32.5-inch arms, which is why I believe he should make that move to the interior, and even the people there at UCLA talked about how he's mostly a guard. But he was a top 50 overall prospect for me, one of the 3 linemen overall that have a chance here probably to start as rookies for the Packers, and Ryan's going to probably replace Royce Newman right away at guard, while being able to fill in a tackle in a pinch, if that's what they need from him. And then on day 3, Romeo Dubs, a guy that made a lot of sweet music together with quarterback Carson Strong in Nevada, working on a lot of those timing-based routes like speed outs, curls, and flats, but also connecting downfield, him being a real big play threat. Also has great elevation in terms of being able to play above the rim. His 2021 season was kind of marked by drops and just inconsistency. The issue for him is the lack of understanding of how to really address the football, too often clapping at it and letting it get in his frame. That's something that he definitely has to continue to work on, and I'm not sure if he's the most natural receiver, but in terms of the speed to get downfield, the elevation, the size that he brings to the table, probably putting him at Z is more of that speed element. He could have a certain role for the Packers here, which their receiving corps needed an influx of speed, and now they bring him in along with Watson. So I think it's going to be more big plays for the air potentially if the O-line is also more set, because it was a lot of quick game last year since they didn't have David Bakhtiari and just injuries across the O-line. Which we get to here with Zach Tom, who is a very interesting prospect because he could potentially start across all 5 spots on the O-line, has starting experience at both tackle spots and the center position, Cadillac quickness out of his stance, and brings his hips through to contact in exceptional form. Had an absurd combine performance where he finished in the 92nd percentile or better at every single drill. And he has some really impressive tape, mirroring some of the better edge rushers in the ACC, while also showing out at East-West Shrine practices when they moved him back to center to some degree. When you look at his overall frame, there's very little muscle distributed across it, particularly with the thin waist and kind of skinny calves. And he doesn't really bring a meat streak in the run game with arms that don't crack the 33-inch mark that you like to see from offensive tackles, which is why I primarily look at him as a center or potentially guard. But I think he can be an optimal 6th man and jump in at any of those side spots probably. So at worst, if he's going to be your primary backup, to get him here in the 4th round, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I really think that he can jump in anywhere and be a solid starter for them. And then Enekbari, also a lot later than some people had him going, has that crazy 83.5-inch wingspan with nearly 35-inch arms and 10.5-inch hands. You really see him lock out and set a physical edge in the run game. And while he only had 4 sacks this past season, he was always a guy in terms of the total pressure numbers, very impressive. One of the favorites of Pro Football Focus for the last couple of years. With that being said, he's simply a limited athlete, testing in the bottom 5 for the position across the board and not doing the agility drills, which is where I actually would have expected him to struggle in terms of the change of direction, the lateral agility. That was the biggest question mark that I had for him. I think he'll be a rotational player on the edge for them, behind Rashawn Gary and Preston Smith, obviously. And he'll play hard for them whenever he's out on the field. So getting him here in the 5th round is pretty good value. And then we get to the 4 7th rounders. First up with Carpenter, 6'3", 225 pounds with a massive 80.5-inch wingspan. This guy could legitimately play Sam linebacker, but he also has plenty of experience in deep coverage and double-digit career special teams tackles. Somewhat limited in his change of direction and probably looked at as a tweener or maybe dime backer for some teams. As a tackler, he tends to stop his feet at times when trying to wrap somebody up from the side, but I think he adds needed depth at safety, and he can maybe be deployed, as I said, as this dime backer / big slot against side ends, and I think as a 7th round, definitely worth throwing a dart at. And then Jonathan Ford, I didn't really study, or anybody on the Miami defense this year for that matter, but gives them some size up front at 6'5", 330 plus pounds, and gives them a backup at the nose with 2-gap ability behind Kenny Clark, even though he has rather limited playmaking production. I want to talk about a little bit more about Rasheed Walker, who was my number 9 overall tackle, widely built left tackle with plenty of junk in the trunk, aggressively coming off the ball, and has some heavy hands at first contact in the run game, as well as that massive lower body to anchor and pass protection, and pretty light feet to go along with that. I thought last year he showed much better patience in his sets, and I really think he has a lot of potential, even though his tape is still very up and down, I'd say. Surrendered nearly twice as many total pressures last season compared to 2020, and his PFF grade also nosedived quite a bit, even though I don't necessarily agree. I think in terms of somebody who can play on both sides of tackle, has quality experience there, and really a lot of talent still to build out in terms of the technical imperfections that he still has to work on. I think he could eventually start for them at right tackle and at least be a quality backup for them for a long time. And then finally, Samari Toure has great starts-up quickness before and after the catch, kind of slippery with the ball in his hands as this gadget player from Nebraska, but still fairly unrefined as a route runner. Probably wanted to add some return talent, and you can drop some touches from an offense. The types of guys that you usually get in those 7th rounds. Full transparency, I would have been more critical of the Packers the day after the first round as well. And don't get me wrong, I still don't like the Walker pick, since he was a fringe top 10 linebacker for me, like I said. But that's more of a personal evaluation thing maybe, because I thought receiver should have finally been the priority. But to get 2 impact starters in the front 7 and still be able to package those 2 second rounders for Watson, who I had going there at pick 28, I can't hate that. And I thought what they were able to accomplish got better every day, with Ryan to me as a top 50 prospect, getting him in the 90s, and then you get on day 3 a bunch of guys that I valued higher, and I believe 5 of those 7 could easily make the active roster and actually start games for them potentially. That's pretty damn good. I like the depth that they've added on the O-line. They keep investing into the defensive front, which particularly of Wyatt there, you get a guy who can be more disruptive and give you some playmaking skills. A freak receiver and another one who I think gives them more of a vertical element, plus some role players on day 3. Yeah, this class has grown more and more on me as the time goes by. And then finally we got the Minnesota Vikings, and they arguably had the oddest draft of any team, simply based on the fact that it didn't make any of the selections that they originally owned heading into the weekend. The first 2 trades that they made were with other NFC North teams, which you just don't see a whole lot of. So good luck with any of the mock drafts, as long as Quesiado Fomensa is there as the general manager for them. So with the final pick of the first round for the 2nd overall, Louis Cine, the safety out of Georgia. 2nd round, 42nd overall, Andrew Booth Jr., the cornerback out of Clemson. 59th overall, also in the 2nd round, Ed Ingram, the interior offensive lineman out of LSU. 3rd round, 66th overall, Brian Asamoah, the linebacker out of Oklahoma. 4th round, 118th overall, Caleb Evans, the cornerback out of Missouri. 2 5th-round picks, Ezezi Otomewo, the edge defender out of Minnesota, and Ty Chandler, the running back out of North Carolina. 2 more 6th-round picks, Darren Lowe, the offensive tackle out of Illinois, and Jalen Naylor, the wide receiver out of Michigan State. And then finally in the 7th round, Nick Muse, the tight end out of South Carolina. So first up here we've seen who they got after moving all the way back from 12 overall with the Lions like I already described. Love this dude charging up the alley, absolutely fearless. You see some collisions with Alabama's 230-pound back Brian Robinson Jr., where the running back is taking the worst of it in terms of Cine just throwing his body at him and knocking him backwards. And despite his aggressiveness, he actually has been a very reliable tackler, only missing 11 of 159 career attempts. You look at the coverage numbers last year, limited opponents to just 6.6 yards per target as the next closest coverage defender, playing a lot in the deep post and racing things in front of him. And he kind of surprised some people with his athletic testing, including a 4.37 in the 40, so he has that high level speed. He does, however, also bring an extremely narrow frame that may not coincide with the type of aggressive, violent player that he is, where there may be a chance for injury at some point down the road. And when matched up against receivers vertically, when he's like in 2 deep coverages and gets caught flat-footed a little bit at times, he can kind of have his issues flipping and running with those guys. You saw 2 long touchdowns against Alabama these last 2 years. The first one against 2020 against John Mechie, where he had a corner blitz and him having to pick up a receiver just pushing vertically and getting burned in the process. And then last we saw that memorable play in the SEC championship game with Jameson Williams, that kind of stutter go route, where he was the safety capped over the top and Jameson was able to get behind both guys. But Cine was one of my personal favorites in this draft. Now you put him next to Harrison Smith from Minnesota, and I think we'll see a lot of split safety looks under defensive coordinator Ed Donatel, where he's going to be a demon charging up the alley. I think he's going to be a really good player for them. And also Andrew Booth Jr., who they moved back another 21 spots with the Packers this time in exchange for picks 53 and 59, but then end up going back up 11 spots with the Colts to secure Booth here 42nd overall for a swap of 3rd and 4th rounders along with 6th. I don't believe anybody in this class quite matches the feat of Booth, just a tremendous talent, and he's incredible at the catch points as well, where he's fighting receivers for the ball and oftentimes the one getting his hands on it. So ran at 29 of 47 targets last season for just over 300 yards and 2 touchdowns, but also came up with 3 interceptions himself. Dude just flies up against screens and has no fear of sticking his face in the fan. However, he did only spend 65 snaps in man coverage in 2021, where his athleticism kind of saved him at times in terms of not being perfectly in phase right away and being able to get back there. And he was way too reckless as a tackler, missed 11 of his 42 tackling attempts, and just has to learn how to break down in space and stay on his feet. I think the Vikings desperately needed to get a potential young stud at the cornerback spot, with their best guy at the position being a 32-year-old Patrick Peterson. Booth was my number 3 corner purely based on tape, and there were some injury concerns that I'm not totally aware of where exactly this medical stand in terms of just some of the nicks and bruises that he's had at Clemson. I think if he clears medically, he's going to be one of the best corners coming out of this draft. And then we get to Ed Ingram, the guard at LSU, who is really built like a fridge, delivers some real thump at first contact in the run game, and moves large men against their will routinely. He can also absolutely stonewall pass rushers with an incredible anchor, and was responsible for only 11 total pressures and almost 500 pass blocking snaps last season if you look at the numbers. He does, however, get his weight too far out in front and his eyes down a lot of times as a run blocker, and maybe not suited for an outside zone based offense, which is kind of interesting because that's kind of what the Vikings have been traditionally these last few years. Did have below average combine testing across the board outside of the 40-yard dash, including a horrific 20.5-inch vert. Maybe if we see more duo and stuff like that, a guy that can really deliver some vertical movement, and also in pass pro, that ability to just own his space and protect the interior of the pocket. And then Brian Asamoah, kind of a cleanup machine with all the slanting that Oklahoma does on the defensive line, but also has a pretty large wingspan in terms of being able to fight off blocks and stuff like that. You see his ability, the speed to sink in cover 2 and deny shots down the seams, and when he can anticipate a snap as a blitzer, he looks like a bat shot of hell. So he's a really fun player to study in terms of flying all over the field. He is, however, only 220 pounds, and that lack of size kind of you see in his playing style, forcing him to sidestep blocks instead of stacking and shedding when it's necessary. And he's just kind of tough to project to an NFL scheme with defined run fits, since it was also much about see ball, get ball type of attitude and chasing after the ball at Oklahoma. So I'm curious about his exact role, since they do have two bigger linebackers there in Eric Kendricks and Jordan Hicks now. So maybe he's a dime option early on, and as a spy maybe in some occasions, especially against Justin Fields from the Bears. So it's going to be interesting how exactly they want to use him, but he was my 7th ranked linebacker and maybe a couple of spots higher than I had him on my personal big board. So I didn't hate that pick, unlike some other people. And then we get to the 4th round, Caleb Evans, who they actually gave up a 4th rounder next year to move out those 38 spots for the guy that he said he was watching in the dark at night himself. So that's obviously weird as fuck. But I like the player, patient feet and 32.5-inch arms to dictate route stems, active communicator in zone coverage, and follows receivers towards his teammates. He does a nice job of breaking down one-on-one tackling situations, and he did have a very solid pro combat performance, better than most people expected probably. Doesn't show that quick burst to get back into phase after receivers create some separation, sharper breaks, and he can be a bit clunky in his transitions versus double moves. Also, not much urgency, I believe, pursuing the ball in the run game, but the Vikings just continue to add talent to that cornerback group, where the young guys that they have there just haven't been able to really step up in those roles. So I don't mind that pick at all. And then in the 5th round, Otomewo, long muscular body at 6'5", 280 pounds with 34.5-inch arms, has the ability to lock out and sink his hips to hold the point of attack. And while he only had 2 sacks last season, 29 additional pressures, just somebody who's not going to stop working those hands and keeps going, has power, has quickness of the ball, kind of the complete package in terms of the athletic profile, but just not a lot of awareness for run schemes or a plan as a pass rusher. The light overall simply just hasn't really gone off for him, despite being a redshirt senior, which is a bit alarming, but you get in there, learn behind Daniil Hunt and Zadarius Smith early on, get him into an environment where he has time to grow, and you can kind of mold him into the player that you want him to be. Then Ty Chandler, who started his career at Tennessee, where he had over 2,500 yards and 16 touchdowns from scrimmage, along with contributing as a kick returner, before going to the Tar Heels and replacing kind of that duo that they had there with Michael Carter Jr. and Javonte Williams, where he went for over 1,300 yards and 50 more touchdowns there. What I really like about him, that start-stop quickness, being able to excel and change up his stride lengths. And then when he gets to the open field, he can give those guys a lot of different looks with the footwork and being able to plant off either foot, as well as in the receiving game, what he can do with the ball in his hands, just making people miss in the flats. He's a very fun jitterbug type of player. May lack power to actually break tackles or drive the pile, and he definitely needs to work runs more from a conceptual perspective, and that his blockers make an impact rather than trying to affect defenders individually. That's kind of the note that I had on him. But a lot of times he's just more so trying to set defenders up to make them miss rather than actually allowing his blockers to get in the way. And you look at the Vikings with Dalvin Cook and Alexander Madison kind of established as that base down duo. So you're probably competing with second-year man Kane Nwango as the third down back and for some return duties. And I think Chandler actually a more talented player. Maybe not the pure speed that Nwango brings to the table, but overall that ability to make people miss, I really like what he brings. Then we get to Wadarian Lowe, very experienced started left tackle in Big Ten, presents a thick torso, massive 35.5-inch arms, and 10.5-inch hands. He really has some force in those paws to create displacement in the run game, and he can turn to clamps to shut down rushes and passing downs. But he doesn't move defenders in the run game quite like his massive frame would suggest, and doesn't have the best reactive athleticism in general, while also being a bit lazy with his feet at times. So no obvious option for swing tackle, I think, for Minnesota before this. So maybe Ingram slides out there, but Lowe could see the field in some capacity as a rookie, I believe. Next up, Jalen Naylor, guy who has easy burst off the line and pairs it up with well-timed swipes to win on the outside releases, and a guy that can really get behind the defense as a deep threat. You look at the numbers, also averaging 9.9 yards after the catch last season, which was the fourth best among draft-eligible wide receivers, just that ability to run away from the defense and make that one decisive cut to cut across the grain. You do see him kind of telegraph his routes at times with his body language, and he did drop 3 of his 42 catchable targets last season. While you look at the physical measurements, barely cracking 30-inch arms and 9-inch hands at 5'11", with 0 contested catches last season. So he's probably a pure deep threat, but just another guy who can bring some speed to the table, along with last year's mid-round pick, Emil Smith-Marset, as you have a lot of those route-running, smaller slot receiver types there, and now you add some speed to that unit, which I really like. And then finally, Nick Muse, I did not study. A couple of notes that I took when watching other players play against South Carolina. Willing blocker with 4.7 speed, has to work on cutting down drops by addressing the ball better, and his short arms allow defenders to lock out against him in the run game. So with a very underwhelming tight end group from Minnesota after Irv Smith Jr., who's coming off an injury, it makes some sense to add as a depth piece, but I think that's really what he is only. So once again, a very interesting, kind of odd approach to the draft from Kwesi and the staff in their first draft together. I thought they should have gotten a little bit of value in both their in-division trades, considering there's usually always a small tax to play, at least for the team wanting to move up, and it should have been arguably even a bit higher when you're dealing with a division rival. But I do like most of the players that they brought in. They desperately needed reinforcements in the secondary, and if everything works out with Booth's medical situation, they got my number 3 safety and cornerback each, a road-grading guard who can protect the interior of the pocket, tremendous range at the second level of Asamoah, who can be a real playmaker if you protect him from his size deficits. And then on day 3, a good combination of proven players and developmental guys in a long, technically sound corner in Evans, a high upside edge defender who hasn't figured things out yet in Otomewo. Chandler is this really fun third down back at least. And then more so solid depth pieces who can win in certain roles. Maybe no crazy steals or whatever, but also nothing that I really disagreed with. Just the process behind it was a bit questionable. And that brings us to the divisional draft rankings, where I wanted the Detroit Lions at number 1. Like I said, bringing in real impact players, just not forcing a quarterback pick here if their evaluations don't tell them to. Like I said, kind of building up that house instead of just throwing a guy in there and seeing what he brings to the table. You can argue that they fleeced the Vikings in that first round trade that they did, and a bunch of guys on day 3 who I think are going to play a significant role for them. Then we got the Green Bay Packers, who, like I said, kind of got better every single day. Didn't love the Walker pick in the first round, but you get a penetration style player and Devontae Wyatt later on. Solid depth on the offensive line, and just some guys on day 3 who I think will play roles for them. I mentioned it's just the draft that started growing more and more on me as the 3 days went along and as I looked at it and reflected on it after the draft had wrapped up. Then the Vikings, kind of an odd way of doing things maybe, trading inside your division and just moving all over the place without maybe really any real purpose or acquiring value. But I like the class overall that they brought in. Can't give them 100% credit for bringing in Booth because there were those injury concerns and I can't really judge that, but based on tape, like I said, my number 3 corner, get those 2 studs in the secondary for a long time. I think that's really what they needed as part of that combination of getting guys who can play right away and some other guys who can develop down the road. And then finally, I didn't hate what they did, and once again, 2 guys at the top here who can really help them in the secondary, be impact players for them for a long time. A lot of developmental type of players, especially on the offensive line on day 3, which you can argue if that's the right approach here for a team that needs help right now, and just not really helping out your quarterback who's in his second year and was getting beat up last season Sure, you're working on the defense, and for him not to have to score a bunch of points next season, but looking at the skill position players, especially at the receiver position, it leaves things to be desired, I believe, and I'm not sure if grabbing Velus Jones and Treston Ebner is going to really change things around for them. So didn't hate what they did, didn't love the approach maybe, but overall I think the entire division did pretty well. But that's going to do it for our first division here. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet, and share it with a couple of friends. As I mentioned at the top, we'll alternate between conferences here, going from north to east, south and west. So later this week, that means we'll get to the AFC North before we move on to the Eastern divisions. Once again, the link to my page, helloswithfootballtalk.com, for even more detailed breakdowns is in the video description, as well as my social media handles, which you can also see on the screen right now. Hope to see you back soon and that you follow along with the series. So until then, see you later. Peace!